This narrative draws inspiration from the life of Dan Millman, a renowned American gymnast. It's a motivational tale offering a fresh outlook on life, and if grasped fully, it has the potential to transform your life. One night, Dan Millman had a troubling dream in which he was executing challenging stunts on a trampoline. His routine was going well until he landed a flip, and one of his legs shattered like glass. The sight horrified everyone, but a mysterious man in brown shoes calmly started gathering the broken pieces. Dan awoke in a panic and decided to take a walk to calm himself. During his walk, he came across a gas station with a grocery store. He purchased a few items, and then an old man entered wearing the very same shoes Dan had seen in his dream. Dan pointed out, "Your shoes don't match," to which the man responded, "One is new, the other is old." After leaving the store, Dan noticed the man sitting outside, but when he looked back again, the man was inexplicably on the roof. This startled Dan, as it seemed impossible for an old man to ascend to the roof so quickly and without assistance. Dan questioned him about it, but the man remained silent, simply staring at him, so Dan walked away. At his college, Dan was the top trampolinist, yet he was never content with his performances. He believed himself superior to others, which made him somewhat arrogant. In his quest to prove himself, he practiced triple flips instead of the safer double flips, a highly challenging and perilous move. Dan aspired to become the best athlete by mastering a stunt no one else had achieved. However, he failed and fell. His coach, deeming it madness, remarked, "You're an excellent athlete, but triple flips are beyond reach. They demand extraordinary strength, flawless technique, and utter fearlessness. Even the slightest mistake could result in severe injury or death." These words disheartened Dan. Recognizing the need for specialized training, he turned to the old man for help. Dan questioned him, "How did you scale that 12-foot-high vertical wall in mere seconds?" "I'm a gymnast, and I know no athlete can do that." The man responded, "You're too weak to grasp this now, and there's much for you to learn." However, Dan, prideful of his training and knowledge, retorted, "I know everything, test me on anything." The man asked, "Are you happy?" Dan found the question trivial, but replied, "My dad is wealthy, I get excellent grades, I have great friends, I'm good-looking, and girls are eager to be with me." The man responded, "If you have everything, why can't you sleep at night? You came to me at 3 a.m. yesterday, and now you're here again at 3 a.m. today." Hearing this, Dan began comparing the man to the philosopher Socrates, and started calling him Socrates. Socrates then posed another question: "What would you do if you weren't on the Olympic team?" This question shook Dan because he had never considered anything beyond the Olympics, but why had Socrates asked this? Dan thought Socrates was mad and tried to forget about him. As part of his daily routine, he enjoyed clubbing with friends, drinking, and impressing girls. Yet, during these moments, Socrates would suddenly appear briefly, reminding Dan to reflect on his behavior. Dan returned to meet Socrates. During their conversation, a girl named Joy brought them food. As they ate, Dan began shoveling food into his mouth hastily. Socrates remarked, "You should savor your food and eat slowly." He pointed out Dan's bad habits and informed him that if he wished to train with him, he would have to give up TV, meat, alcohol, drugs, and physical relationships. Dan, still prideful, accepted a challenge to maintain a squat position for just 5 minutes. What seemed simple soon tested Dan's patience, and he fell off the table. His pride shattered, Dan angrily prepared to leave. Socrates said, "Self-experience teaches us many new things. The answers to your questions lie within you. Stop seeking externally and look inside yourself through self-experience. Only then will you understand that you can't sleep because you're empty inside and fear that emptiness." He added that a warrior must control both body and mind, agreeing to train Dan like a warrior. The next day at college, Dan learned that his friend Kyle had fractured his hand during practice, jeopardizing his Olympic qualification. This news deeply upset their coach, as Kyle was the top pommel horse gymnast. That night, Dan visited Socrates, who was repairing a car. When Socrates asked for a wrench, Dan deliberately threw it at him quickly, but Socrates caught it with ease without even looking. Dan tried again, and Socrates caught it once more. Socrates remarked, "Our minds are cluttered with countless useless thoughts that obscure our goals and lead us astray." He then slapped Dan to provoke him, challenging him to retaliate. Dan remained calm at first, but when he did attack, Socrates easily defeated him, advising, "Anything in your mind other than your goal is useless. Clear the trash from your mind," and asked Dan to meet him at the campus bridge the next morning. The following day, upon arriving at the bridge, Socrates pushed Dan into the water. Dan angrily shouted at him, but Socrates explained, "When you were falling, your mind was entirely clear, but now it's filled with trash again." Dan retorted, My mind isn't filled with trash. Socrates then took control of Dan's mind, seeing everything within it. He told Dan, "Focusing on these useless thoughts prevents you from living in the present. When you focus entirely on the present moment, you'll realize what you're capable of and how well you can do it." After Kyle's injury, the coach evaluated all the athletes' pommel horse performances. Utilizing the techniques Socrates had taught him, Dan managed to focus and executed a routine possibly better than Kyle's, leaving everyone astonished. That night Dan shared his joy with Socrates, feeling proud because other athletes were now envious of him. But Socrates remained indifferent, saying, "You're still living in the past and are proud of your performance. This means you've learned nothing yet." With that, he sent Dan home, refusing to teach him anything further that night. Later, Dan secretly followed Socrates to the practice room at his college, where Socrates sat on a pole in the shed. When Dan joined him, he realized he could read the thoughts of all the athletes. The shock came when Dan saw himself enter the practice hall. The realization that it was all an illusion made Dan fall down, understanding that Socrates was playing with his mind. Socrates told him, "There's still much to learn," but Dan, frightened, left. This experience negatively impacted Dan. His confidence waned, noticed by his friends and coach, as his performance began to decline. The next day, he met Joy in the park, who had brought food for Socrates. Dan confided in her, "I thought Socrates' methods would make me a better athlete, but the opposite is happening." Socrates then had Dan do things he had never done before, cleaning trash, filling gas tanks, cleaning toilets, and imposed restrictions. No TV, no alcohol, no meat, no drugs, and no physical relationships. Although Dan followed these rules, it all seemed pointless to him. His performance continued to deteriorate, and he struggled to understand Socrates' teachings. One day, out of frustration, he argued with Socrates, asking, "How will cleaning toilets make me a warrior?" Socrates responded, "I was teaching you to meditate in any situation, reducing your arrogance and bad habits." But Dan's anger only grew. He confronted Socrates, saying, "You asked me on the first day if I was happy. Now I ask you, are you happy at this worthless gas station?" Dan saw Socrates as a loser who had failed to achieve success or wealth and felt trapped by his philosophical ramblings. Socrates urged him to control his emotions, but Dan refused to listen and angrily declared, "I'll find my happiness on my own," leaving the training. Dan failed to realize that Socrates was teaching him the value of service to others, which could have humbled him. Instead, Dan returned to his old lifestyle, drinking in clubs, eating meat, sleeping with girls, and speeding on his motorcycle. Here the story ends.